Hello, everybody. So nice to see your faces. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. Welcome to the audience. We have a great panel for you tonight. First, I want to say to those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. To those of you who are members, thank you and welcome. I see a new member, Mike the Dad Crosby. Thank you so much for joining. You're really helping me do this kind of work. So, this channel, if you're not familiar, is all things education. Tonight, we're talking subject matter expertise and knowledge transfer to our students. I brought this panel together because I've spent so much time on the channel talking about critical theory, specifically critical race theory, but all critical theory, all of the critical pedagogy, social emotional learning, culturally responsive education, and all of those things. And I've only touched here and there on what it's doing to subject matter, what your kids are missing out on while we're spending so much time focusing on racial essentialism and, their emotion, their feelings and gender theory and things like that. When's the knowledge happening? Like when are they learning how to read, write, do math? And more importantly, even what math, what science, what English, what history, etc. are they learning? Because what you may not be aware of is that this critical pedagogy changes what that is. The social justice infects the subject matter. That's something that may be a surprise to you. But what I think you're going to hear from my panel experts tonight is exactly how that works and what it looks like. So you can be on the lookout. It's there. I'll just tell you it's there. But so you can recognize it when it pops up. So I didn't have a specific agenda. There are a couple of panel members who are trying to get here. They've had some power outages, as you may be aware. We've had some rough weather around the country today, but they will join when they can. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go in no particular order. I'm just going to kind of go around in a circle and let each panelist introduce him or herself and then explain what they're seeing, what they're not seeing, why it bothers them, and why you should be concerned as a parent. Okay, so let's kick it off tonight let's go with Allison. I feel like a game show host. Okay.
Hi there. So my name is Allison Coates. I am a co-founder of a small nonprofit in the North Carolina Triangle area called Bright Links. Bright Links is primarily focused on trying to build connections between gifted children who don't get their needs met in the normal school system. Prior to that, I had started my own nonprofit called the Middle School Math Institute in Minnesota, and for several years tried to improve math education in schools by actually teaching math to teachers. So I have been, and now I am a homeschooling parent and previously had children in private schools. So I've seen both from the parent side and from the educator side and from the consultant side what's happening. So I'll primarily speak on a little bit about the math in particular. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about is Deb said, she has been educating her channel about critical theory. So the truth is that critical theory came to math and the elementary school math in the 90s. And so this is now 25 years of critical theory in elementary math. And what that means is it's been 25 years of teachers being told it doesn't matter if students get the answer right. All that matters is they think in some mathematical process. It's been 25 years of them saying, we don't need a sage on the stage. We don't need a teacher who teaches how to solve a problem. We need them to be a guide on the side. We need them to let the students develop their own mathematical knowledge based on inquiry. And so this, sometimes called constructivism, but it's also just a piece of this critical theory, was all about, well, it did many things at the same time. So one is it took the focus off teaching, right? It no longer required a teacher to teach. A teacher didn't have to know their subject then to teach. So that was a win for administrators, right? It was also a win for education schools because not only could they teach critical theory, they could get rid of teaching math and have more time to teach critical theory, more time to teach constructivism, because what mattered is how you achieve this idea of becoming a mathematician. But all of this was premised on something absurd, which was that, 6,000 years of mathematics is something a student can figure out in 12, right? Does that make sense? No, it does not. But they lapped it up because, and it's fun for a teacher who does know math or has at least learned math rotely to see connections and think, I understand now. And so they wanted to do what I call cargo cult education. They mimicked what math professors do and thought that if they had children at 6, 7, 8 mimic it themselves, they would magically become mathematicians. The same way that you would have a 6-year-old play doctor with a scalpel, and then by the age of 22, right, they would successfully have your appendix removed, right? And yet they were sure that this worked. And so it's been 25 years of this movement. So there was pushback. You're going to find this hard to believe, but in fact, Common Core was part of the pushback. So everyone hates Common Core, but what they don't understand is it was an attempt to fix constructivism by people who couldn't say out loud what was wrong with constructivism. And one of the things that was wrong was that teachers didn't know any math. So the purpose of Common Core was to nationalize a curriculum, because then it didn't matter if your elementary teacher can't do fractions or doesn't know, and I know this from experience, that not every teacher who has passed their teacher credential and received their master's knows that the reason there's a 6 in the multiplication table when you go over the row 3, over to column 3 and down to row 2 is because that's the number of squares in that rectangle. That's 2 by 3. I literally taught teachers who were already licensed that that's what 2 by 3 meant. And that's not the weakest teacher I've met. Okay. So and in all honesty, elementary school teachers who didn't go into school to learn math and didn't go into school to teach math are afraid of math. So this saved them, right? Constructivism made them free. They don't have to be good at math. Kids will figure it out for themselves. And by the time they don't, it's now middle school's problem. And so the kids who can't do arithmetic because no one teaches it to them then can't do fractions. And then this continues to cascade badly. So kids who have been getting A's in math all the way through school smash into middle school and can't do math. And they don't know what they're doing wrong. They've been told they're great at math because they, have some process where they kind of guess and check, or maybe they've been taught some other thing where they draw a nice picture or lots of circles or they count things. And now they just can't compute because no one's ever asked it of them. So that's what happens at the middle school level, which is a disaster. But as you can imagine, you don't catch up, right? 6th, 7th, and 8th grade is not enough time to fix what you didn't get in K-5. And likewise, you hit algebra, it's like running into a brick wall. And so as this cascade has happened, we now graduate kids who can only do algebra if you pretend what we now call algebra is algebra. But it isn't the algebra of 25 years ago. It isn't the algebra one you took 30 some years ago. It isn't the algebra even of I have a book from 1858. Algebra 1 in 1858 was serious algebra. And that was what high school students did. Not everyone was a high school student, but the ones who did real algebra 1 and 2, which we don't. So I think the hard part is parents can't believe what I'm saying is true. It's absurd, right? It's absurd that you have elementary school teachers who don't understand how the multiplication table works. It's absurd that they can't add fractions, but it's true. And so critical theory excused them from having to. So it was a win even for the people who weren't true believers. Mm-hmm. And so the pushback, it came, there was an attempt to push back to, we need to have real standards. We need to have some real math. And so the new critical race theory is again, a push in the other direction. Now it's racist to demand the right answer.
But so, that doesn't push back, though. It sort of
no, I meant Common Core was, even though everyone hates it, Common Core was actually an attempt to say, this is how you compute an answer, even if everyone said, what are you doing setting national standards? How can you do this? What? You didn't even ask us. But it was because they said, we can't trust teachers. We can't teach teachers. We're not going to fix education schools. We're just going to make them, read the script so carefully that they'll get this. And so at least there was the belief for a couple of years there that the answer had to be the right answer again. But now that's racist. And critical theory is now pushing back again to say it's racist to demand the right answer. It's racist to demand computational fluency. It's unacceptable that you would think kids have to actually know 2 + 2 = 4. It could equal 5. Critical theory, 2 + 2 could equal 5.
1984.
That's right.
George Orwell. I mean, if we're getting down to it. So when you hear about things like the California framework, when they're sort of changing the pathway on top of all this, explain to the audience what's going on with that and what's happening out in California, because it's going to probably happen.
So again, back in the 90s, California moved back to this constructivism, and then there was this push in California to have standards. And one of the moves at a national level was to point out that internationally, other countries teach Algebra 1 in 8th grade. That's the international standard, and we should do the same. That was a beginning move in the late 90s and the early aughts that people said Algebra 1, not in 9th grade, but in 8th grade. And so California adapted to this. There was a lot of demand that they do so, and they succeeded in getting that as a pathway into California. So kids who worked hard, honors kids could move up. Right. We can talk about later whether it was any good, but it was at least a pathway, right?
Okay.
And so now the pathway goal is to get rid of that, to detrack kids, to not allow kids to be put in classes with their peers so that they can accelerate faster. And the move is, again, to remove Algebra 1. And if you remove Algebra 1 in 8th grade, then there is no pathway to calculus as a senior in high school. Now, already in our country, more than 50% of the students who take calculus take it in high school. So calculus has become a high school subject across our entire country. And you can debate whether or not that's necessary for everyone, but it is the standard. And this says, for reasons that have to do with the inequality in who is sitting in a calculus classroom, our solution is to kill that calculus classroom from being available. So Asian kids can't be in it, white kids can't be in it, whoever would be working hard, that's got to be eliminated.
Okay. All right. Wow. All right. So let's go. I'm going to let Ryan in just to get him into the mix. Hi, Ryan. How are you? So our guests are going to be coming in. We have one more person also. We've had, as I mentioned, we've had some power issues around the country. So let's go to Patrick, because you are going to talk about physics, which is also math related. What are you seeing in terms of physics? So tell a little bit of who you are and what's manifesting. And guys, everyone who's watching, we're going to come back to all these people. And if you have questions, you can put them in the comments as well. But we're just going to go around briefly to each person and then dig into it a little bit more. So Patrick, what are you seeing?
Okay, well, my name is Patrick Labelle, and I'm from Quebec, and I got my undergrad degree in Quebec in physics, and then I went to the US for my graduate, for my PhD, and then I've been teaching for the last 20 years. Here I'm teaching in the college, but the Quebec education system is quite different from the US or even the rest of Canada. So what I'm teaching is somewhere between, well, students are 17, 18, 19. But I also teach at 2 local universities now and then. So I don't know much about lower grades because I don't have kids and I'm not really in contact with high school teachers here. But I've been more in touch with higher level university professors and so on. And so I've seen the last 20 years the background of the incoming students getting lower and lower in quality, and that's clear. But what has been the most disturbing for me, coming from physics, is to see how even researchers in physics and in mathematics and university professors being as easily brainwashed as anybody else. I mean, I used to think that those people were very, very high IQ in general, and they're very, very smart in their own field. But when it comes out, when discussing anything outside of their very narrow field, they're as easy to manipulate and to follow the crowd and to believe the mainstream media, and to it's amazing to me to see how they can lack in critical thinking, even if they have a very high IQs. And I tend to think of them as high IQ morons in many cases.
Okay.
But I'm sorry. But
no, it's okay.
But it's really it's upsetting to me, and I see this CRT, BLM, climate hysteria, all those things. They are pushing for that, and again, that's been the most surprising thing for me. And they spend resources. Like, I can talk about it a bit later, but here the science, for example, in this university, the science program has opened a position for diversity, inclusion person who is working full-time to do, I don't know what. I tried to find out, but I cannot find anything else than organizing presentations by other people who are paid to promote the same thing. I mean, it's all a little clique of people. And to see people in science, professors in science, pushing for that instead of using that money to help students, to me has been a huge disappointment.
Have you felt pressure to sort of dumb down what you're teaching or lower your expectations based on the students coming up who've had lower expectations? Or are you able to teach physics the way you believe physics should be taught?
We've done that a little bit, but not much, because I think even 20 years ago, I think we were not getting much more from high school. We had to basically assume that all the basics were not understood and start from there. So it has not been a big difference for me for the.
Yeah. Okay. So again, sort of like Allison was saying, if we went back to, the early part of the 20th century or the later part of the 19th century, it might have been a whole different situation. But because this has been going on for so long, it was already done. Yes. So you're just, whatever was supposed to happen in high school, and parents, I hope you're listening, that, what that diploma says is less and less each year, and probably already not much. So that if your student is taking physics, or your student is taking chemistry, or advanced math, they may or may not be actually getting educated in that subject the way you think they are. It's on the transcript and it has the class name and description, but that doesn't mean they know enough to then go into the college class at a level above. Let's go back and review or remediate everything you were supposed to learn in high school, and now I'm teaching you a high school physics class, or I'm teaching you a high school chemistry class, or whatever. Does that sound sort of accurate? Yeah. Okay, wonderful, fantastic. All right, let's talk a little bit briefly about, let's pivot a little bit and talk about English language arts and literature. Let's start with Ryan. Let's start with you, and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're teaching now, and what are you seeing in terms of, I would ask, because I know you're dealing with ELA, but also you have some things to say about discipline too, right?
Yeah, in fact, that's what I just made a note on. So, hi everybody. I actually currently teaching 6th and 7th grade ELA, urban kids, so very challenging. I've had the privilege of actually teaching from all the way up to freshman in college, and teaching ELA at the high school level, etc. So the things I'm seeing, let's go back to what Patrick was talking about with the foundations. And a lot of the kids are they've already been out of school for a year and a half. And depending on the location and the parent support at home in the last year, we're getting a lot of kids that we just got to simply get them back into even the how to behave inside the school. We've got a lot of kids that don't. They're not good like they talk to each other like they're at home with their siblings. They very rude to the teachers, depending on where you're at. Certainly, it depends on the population. So when we talk about trying to get them to learn and read and understand the text that they're working on, I think right now in the first couple of weeks of school, I spent more time just trying to get them to follow directions and sit down and behave. And we can't get them to want to learn to read a text and to develop the vocabulary skills. Some of them, even at the middle school level, don't even have the phonics that they need to the building blocks to reading.
Right.
And so the major thing that we've been battling for the first couple of weeks is getting them back into that routine. And then of course we've had none out because of COVID already. So we're running low. We're running into those issues already. So going to the ELA stuff, and I think to kind of to think through one of the biggest issues I see, and I've seen this at even college, is the learned helplessness. There's a very strong learned helplessness. I saw this back in 2009 when I first started teaching, where they don't know how to do something. They don't know how to read this, and they just sit. They don't, they're whatever reason, which I'm trying to work on discovering. They don't try to discover for themselves, because it seems to be maybe for some it's a cognitive overload. Maybe for many, or for some that choose to do that behavior, they don't even have the prerequisites to understand what they're looking at. So we spend, we're working in RTI, for example. We're trying to hit up the different areas, like vocabulary is a big thing, and reading strategy and everything. All those pieces that go along with just reading text. Right. Talk about critical race theory entering into the schools. Number one, that's valuable time that we don't have, that we really can't be giving up to talk about whatever it is that teacher wants to bring into the curriculum or that school. But we're doing read alouds in class because some of these kids won't even take their books home. And so we can't even get that level of reading, let alone start implementing all these other pieces and so forth that the far left in.
Right. Ryan, I think your microphone it keeps cutting out. I don't know if you want to check the connection, but you make a good point here. And I've mentioned this on the channel before, that, when you hear educators talking, in the news, or, you see their Twitter posts, social media posts, they seem to talk about teaching and learning as if they're in an alternate universe. When I read them and they talk about, in the classroom, we explore and inquire, and they do it. And I'm like, you can barely get them to sit in their seats. Like, what world are you living in? They construct this fantasy around all of this new stuff they're going to put in the classroom. And then I'll see videos, we all see them, of the kids beating each other up, screaming at the teacher. And then I tried to teach a remedial English class this summer, and the kids, you talk about not bringing the books home. I crowdfunded the books. They wouldn't go pick up a free book. They wouldn't read it. And I got complaints from the parents and then the program saying, yeah, you're going to have to pivot because they don't want to read a book. It was remedial English. These were 6th, 7th, and 8th graders who are reading at a 4th grade level.
Deb, I would love to follow up a little about what Ryan was saying about these kids, even pre-COVID, lack the foundational skills for reading. So what happens in an ELA classroom in grades 1 through 5 is the same constructivism, the same, they're going to figure it out. There are actually phrases for this. Grammar is caught, not taught. That's what teachers say to each other. They say, listen, can't you hear? People learn to speak grammatically correct sentences by speaking grammatically correct sentences.
No,
so the children will not need to be taught grammar. And similarly, there is an expectation that what they call blended literacy, which is not really phonics and is absolutely not synthetic phonics, that they will figure out, that they will break the code of phonics on their own. So what happens to these young students is they are literally not taught phonics. And then they have to do some sort of look-say, and they have to look at a book, and they are supposed to use the context clues that the book has. The pictures, for example, the conversation that they were maybe following in the book, some ideas about, what makes sense in an early reader. But by the time you hand them a book that has words and no pictures, they are literally lost. They cannot tell the difference between a word like biology and a word like, bi anything else, like, right? I've failed to have a good example, but biphone. They can't see that because they can't even syllabalize words. They can't break them into phonemes because no one ever taught them. And the reason why no one ever taught them is because some kids would have learned faster than others. And then they would have had to split them to actually read to them. So instead, if we don't ask them to do that in K-5, right? We won't notice the gaps. We won't see an achievement gap. It won't be visible. And that's the goal. And it goes on to not just grammar and phonics, it goes on to spelling and writing. And so similarly, because you would end up having to hand different books to different children, because one is able to read a biography, right? And another, so those are two words. They wouldn't know the difference between biography and biology because they get stuck on the first syllable and kind of the shape of the bio, and that'd be it. And the Y's at the end, right? They look alike, right? There's no ability to break it down. Mm-hmm. So that speaks to Ryan's claim of the learned helplessness. They are helpless because they have no more skills. Right. And then the second part is because they're, by grade 3, there are kids who are reading at 8th grade level and kids who can't read. There is no chance that a teacher can give one book or one assignment. So instead of reading something together and writing about what they read, summarizing what they read, they journal. And they only write about themselves because it is the only subject that the teacher is sure they know about. And so they become narcissists because the only thing they're ever allowed to talk about are their own feelings and their own experiences, which are primate, right? Which feeds into everything else going on here, right? The truth is not important. Facts are not important. Your human experience is what you bring to the classroom every day and what you're supposed to discuss and write down and talk about. And so by the time you hit middle school, right, when you need skills, because there's no more time for, right, learning to read. It's now reading to learn. There is no reading to learn because they can't read well enough. And kids reach college without knowing how to read a textbook. Like literally, they don't know what to do with all that sentences in front of them and those words that are spaced very closely together. It's too much for them. They haven't learned those skills.
And these are the people we're saying, go borrow tens of thousands of dollars to pay for a college education where you can't actually do the work.
And the colleges are saying, we can't afford to fire these kids. We can't afford to kick them out. So we're not going to. And then the professors must adjust. So it's the professor's part. Add in remedial education. It's, teach it in your class. Don't just teach it outside your class. We can't have even the kids go get remedial education for a credit that doesn't count. No, you've got to push it in. And so the bar has to move down over and over because there's no way to pull these kids through a college degree. But they will be let in because they pay, or you pay. We all pay.
Right. We all pay. Okay. So, Ryan, anything else to add on that?
How am I now? Better?
Yeah, I think it's better
Yeah,
now.
I was using something different. Anyway, one of the things I want to add in, and this comes from, I have a lengthy sports background too, and in the last number of years, and this plays into the reading piece and any other subject we're talking about here, is there's a ton of distractions right now for these kids. And I actually talked to my students today about this. I don't care that they're sixth graders or seventh graders; they need to hear it. Is they have to, they get so stressed out, right? We talk about especially certain populations that they're overstressed, et cetera. And think about this, they've got stress at home and a lot of it's legitimate. And then they have the stress of their notifications on their phone constantly going off, and the stress of their peers, because it's an age group that their peers is really important. And then they have the stresses that they can't read, which is true. And so on and so forth. And so they have all these distractions that are going on and these stresses. And then you add in now that we've been giving them computers to put in front of them, but they don't know how to type. And they literally don't know how to type. I've watched college kids hunt and peck. And so they don't know how to type, but some parents and teachers, well, they can take notes on their computers. So they're distracted by just typing letters. So they're not gathering the information they're getting from the lecture or from the note taking, et cetera. So there's all those pieces. And then the other thing is not just eyesight, but vision. I notice with my athletes that their vision, their peripheral vision, their depth perception, et cetera, and it is not where I think it was in past generations. And I know to some people that might be an awkward thing to talk about with reading, but if a student is reading and they're only picking up one letter at a time, or maybe even just one word at a time, they're distracted in their focus, right? We can only handle about 6 to 8 bits of information at a time. And so the processing there, it's not getting chunked. It's being broken apart a lot of times because they are remedial in their reading ability. And so that becomes an issue for them. And so they get overloaded and they're stressed out and they just don't want to do it anymore. Right. They shut down like my 7-year-old here, he'll shut down when he gets frustrated. And so, there's a lot of different pieces that are at play right now. And the best thing we can do for a lot of these kids is you come back to your original question, which is discipline. We got to get more discipline in the classroom. I see, people that I think are good people, but they permit behaviors because, well, maybe that's just a cultural behavior. And no, it's not. Telling another student to shut up constantly is not acceptable, and we shouldn't allow it to take place. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, go back to what I said earlier. These students are coming in with 1.5 years, some of them. So I'm working with my students to get them to at least catch themselves and say, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Staley. And we're getting there. But then when they go to another classroom, what's going on there. So there's also the added distraction of other kids in the classroom up and about or misbehavior, like the videos that you've posted, Deb, those things. Who's going to learn in that environment?
Who can teach in that environment either? It's not conducive to any of it.
No. And I've lost classroom days this year already, just trying to work on behavior, which is important,
right?
But that's more lost time. And so of course these kids, especially the younger ones, they're going to shut down. Right. Because they can't read. There's all kinds of distractions. They can't process the information. And, why not just cell phones and play video games?
Right. Wow. All right. So, Mrs. G, another English teacher up there, what is going on in your class these days? Are you seeing any similar things or?
Absolutely. So, if you'll excuse me, I have a little bit of a delay, but I go by Mrs. G because I am in the classroom. I teach in the northern Iowa.
I think your volume, you've got an echo a little bit.
Oh, give me 1 second.
Sometimes if you've got like it on somewhere else and it makes an echo. Okay, try again.
Oh, give me 1 second. Let me try this. Is this better?
I think that might be better. On somewhere else and Matt makes an echo. Okay, try again.
Is this better?
Myself. I hear me.
Let me try this. Is this better?
I think that might be better. On somewhere else and Matt makes an echo. Okay, try again.
Is this better?
Myself. I hear me.
Let me try this. Is this better? All right, maybe come back to me.
Okay, mute yourself and we'll come back. See, try your headphones again. Okay, now Gina,
Yes.
you have been working with college students, right? And working on the writing. So here's Ryan talking about middle school, and middle school kids can't read. They're not paying attention. They're stressed out. It's a mess. Okay. Nothing is really happening there. Okay. Does this help you better understand some of the things that you've been working on with kids as they've made it up and now they have to write?
Yeah.
And there you are trying to help them. What have you seen? First, tell people who you are and what you've been doing.
Whew.
And
Yeah.
then-
Moment of silence for all the kids, because what Allison and Brian have been talking about has made me physically ill in the last 35 minutes. So this helps explain some of the things that I have witnessed, and I will elaborate. So my background is actually in biology. I have a master's. I did research. I've been in the academic, like scientific publishing world. So I've done a lot of writing in that way. And I've always written for fun all my life since I was a small child. So that was always just something that I did. And only in the last 5 years or so has it become my job. So I'm a science writer. I'm the editor-in-chief of a website called SciWorthy. And we have a writer training program, and we take a lot of outside submissions from undergrad science majors, graduate students, researchers of like pretty much all levels. And the last year has made me actually not want to take articles from undergrads anymore. And I will talk a little bit more about why. But I mean, where do I even begin? I think what you talked about with the reading is highly disturbing, and also explains something I haven't been able to wrap my head around, which is, why do they come out of college after paying these huge tuition bills? Why can't they write a research paper as part of an internship? That's all I could imagine coming out of college and having a hard time jumping into a job where you're like building a thing, because you don't do that in college. But in college, you write papers, I imagined, right? Like you look up sources and you write about them and you cite
Once upon a time, I mean, I did it in high school.
Right. So I did too. I'm 40. I was actually an early adopter of all of this toxic stuff, and it wrecked my life. So watch my interview on Deb's other show. So
she's recovering.
I'm a survivor in a sense. So I've lost my train of thought. This, like, everything that you guys just talked about is like right now. So I primarily teach writing now, essentially. And I also led a research group with a colleague of mine over the summer with some science interns. And there was a lot of writing involved in that too. Why won't they sit down and engage with the subject matter when they seem to have a high level of interest in it? So there were all these really enthusiastic students we interviewed for this position. There were 30 applicants, only 5 were chosen. It was very competitive, and they seemed well-spoken. They had extensive resumes. They had this sort of quasi-fake professional personality that they kind of put on, which, okay, I don't know, maybe that's a young person thing, maybe. And we were really encouraged, and we thought we'd get a publication done with 5 of them. And they did almost nothing all summer, except in the last week, scrambled to put together something, and it's terrible. So given, okay, on one hand, some of them are international students and they're learning English, so I cut them a little bit of slack. Science is hard enough. Science in a foreign language is double hard. But there were a couple of American students that really dropped the ball, and I was like, why are they so excited about talking about this subject? They stay at this very like 30,000 foot superficial level, and they seem to procrastinate with engaging in the material. And I thought it was just maybe they don't want to, maybe they are like just stressed out, or they have too much going on, they're overcommitted, but maybe they can't read. Maybe these journal articles are like, I know that they're hard to read. Scientific articles are very hard to read, but maybe they're like 20 levels too hard to read, and I thought it was maybe like 3. So this is a new thought for me. But
Right.
The writing, when they submit articles to SciWorthy, these are summaries of scientific studies. So this summer we tried out having them do sort of an unsupervised summary. And if they had trouble understanding the content, we could either help them if we had a background in it, or we could reach out to the study author if we could. So that was a mistake. They had no ability to actually read the paper and extract the key information from it. And these are seniors, juniors, seniors, and college grads in science. And they're the tail of the bell curve. These are the smart kids. These are the ones that want to do an unpaid summer internship at a research institute over the summer. These are not the slacker kids. So I was expecting a lot more than I ended up getting. And their writing is very superficial. It's a lot of filler text that they seem fixated on word count and page count, but not about quality of content. They don't seem to really understand what scientific writing is actually for. They sort of treat it like it's busy work. And they say a lot of things. They're like, it is said that, or research has shown, but they don't cite what the research is. They don't say where they got the information from. Those kinds of things that I have to keep saying, this is a weasel word. This was in the training that I gave you guys before you submitted this. And there's just so many things I could ramble on and on about. I'll go through my little list. So grammar and spell check, we have tools for that, and they don't use them. They submit things that look like they were written on a phone. And they probably were. With non-US students, plagiarism is rampant. That kind of ruined my summer. Like, it took the wind out of my sails with how much plagiarism I got with SciWorthy. That's a legal liability for me. If I publish that on my website, I'm basically stealing someone's work. And the lack of respect for that was just like, it broke my heart. They imitate the language of experts, but there's nothing behind it. They learn how to say things that sound the way that scientists talk, but they don't have the knowledge to back it up. So they use a lot of big words. They string together these sentences like, I'm interested in human performance and nutrition, but from an agricultural perspective. Like that's 5 fields. Like, what? It doesn't make any sense. I hope the person who said that to me never sees this, because I actually care genuinely about him and I want him to do well in life. And I had to explain to him that you can't study that. You have to have that's a whole other topic. So the writing is just like an extension of how their brains are right now, which is like, it just seems like an anxious mess. And I feel for them. Actually, I don't want to make fun of them. I actually ended up giving this kid some career advice. We had a 30-minute Zoom meeting. And he said the stuff I told him about getting a toolkit and focusing on a career path and all those kinds of things that no one had ever told him that before. And my colleague and I talked about this afterwards with sobbing emojis, because we just didn't know what to say. I was fascinated that he got to the end of college and nobody told him that before. So
yeah, before we're done with this panel, that'll be my area that I'm gonna touch on, I think. But wow, I remember reading. If for those of you who aren't members of my locals community, I would encourage you to just head on over, even as a follower, and you might be able to pick up on some of Gina's writings over there, where she's detailed her summer experience and written about it pretty extensively. And you'll get even more detail than she's been able to give us here about what she was specifically seeing in the writing and in the behavior of the students. I'm going to go now to Adrian and introduce yourself and tell us what you're learning about, because you're also dealing with people in a university setting and, seeing what they don't know and aren't able to do that you thought they would have known and been able to do by now.
Well, I hope you all enjoy the planes falling out of the sky and the bridges falling apart.
Not really, no.
So I'm Adrian Wooten. I am a research scientist at a Research One university in the United States. Specifically, I actually study climate science and climate modeling. So I get into some very in-depth technical science on a regular basis myself and doing a lot of research. When I see but I'm also, before I totally forget to plug my own channel, I also run a channel on YouTube called Shio Sophia, where I work on where I talk about issues going on in science and in higher ed and things like that, and have been touching quite frequently on some of the woke issues of late, as most folks have noted, or some of the alarmistic issues in the climate world. If you've probably seen a whole bunch of doom and gloom articles on climate change of late. Yeah. Oh boy. In my capacity professionally, when I interact with students, it's often I'm not a teacher, so I'm not in there teaching classes or interacting with the students every single day, but I am interacting with students because in the center we work in, they come to us, for that, and we're giving internships. We're having students who are doing it, upperclassmen, they're doing research in preparation for graduate school, or they're in graduate school, and one of the staff is a mentor or PhD or master's advisor. Or there's another one in there, and one of the staff is a co-advisor, something like that. And it's been interesting to see in the last few years when I interact with the students in the college that I'm in, that there's been such an incredible tendency and desire to focus more. You're coming into a science degree, but you're focused more on social justice than anything else. And this is an interesting problem because at least in my view, the purpose of being a scientist, purpose of science is the pursuit of the truth. You want to find answers to questions and figure out what the nature of reality is for different things, and in part for the betterment of society. And yet you're teaching of students in K through 12, because I'm of course seeing everybody after K through 12 and usually well after K through 12. They're not just not learning all the things that make me scared for the future of science, just listening to all of you. At this point, and Gina shares my fears with this. They're not learning how to disagree with each other constructively. They're not learning that you have to be able to disagree with each other, because if you go into a career in science and you're going into research, you will run into disagreements every day.
Especially in climate science, right? Because there's so many variables. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The research side of things. You can get into very heated arguments with different scientists over ideas, because you do have a principle that you never target somebody off of what they look like or anything like that. But my fear with the critical theory going into K through 12 education, and of course in college now, is we're teaching kids things that are against the basic fundamental norms of science. The idea of universalism: you judge based upon the work, you don't judge based upon immutable characteristics or professional affiliation or any of those kinds of things. And also, of course, disinterestedness, the idea that you should be doing your work with respect to the truth. Not you're after the truth. You're not after something that is your own self-interest. Whatever the truth is, when you do your work, it's what it is, even if you hate it. But we're teaching kids that they should go after they should always get the answer that they want. And if there's a disagreement with that, that's a problem. In a way, that's the helplessness thing that Ryan, I believe, mentioned. There's that helplessness there that you just, it has to be there. It has to be the way they see it. It has to be that way. And this has led to some interesting things. And so that gives me a lot of concerns for what the future of climate is going to be. And also the idea of the emotional touchy-feely in K through 12. One of the things we found is psychologists have now started diagnosing a condition called eco-anxiety in children, where they end up panicked and paranoid that the world's going to end because climate change is going to end the world. And that's not going to happen. I'm sorry, that is not what actually it says. There's a video on my channel about that if you want the answer there. But they end up causing kids to be really anxious about something they cannot. Well, it's not that they can't do nothing about it. They can, of course, be planting trees and be environmentally conscious, and you can teach that in classes. That's a good thing. I'm fine with that. But teaching them to be utterly afraid that the world's going to end and there's nothing they can do about it, that's the helplessness kind of thing playing out right there. There's other things.
Oh, sorry. I just want to interject one thing, and only because I know that Allison has to go at 9. And so what I'm hearing you say too reflects, and you mentioned it already, that, the things they need to learn to do the science, right? Not to follow it like sheep, but to do it. One of those key components is math, right? So in order to have a disinterested approach to data, you have to have a respect for numbers. You have to understand math. You have to be able to, I feel like a lot goes back to math. And Allison, tell me if you agree, in the sense that, if you don't understand math well enough, and then you go into a field like science, I would think you're more inclined, not less inclined, to do what she's talking about, to make it a sort of a social justice thing, because it's not dominant in your mind that, the numbers say what the numbers say. The data says what it says. Right. I've looked at these numbers and they mean what they mean. I'm not going to find new and different ways to place them on a graph to support my conclusion that I arrived with. I see a lot of that just reading the news. I'm not a very good math student, and I'm like, that's not what the math
says. So I think we're now, having students reach undergrad who have no idea what abstraction is. They can't abstract. They didn't learn in math how to handle abstractions. And so they can't actually handle data because and they don't know what a model is. They're all into modeling. Modeling's the future. We are going to do modeling. But what does it mean to model? And a model, right, is a simplified theory version, a way to handle, right, trying to come up with predictions, right? By its nature, it's wrong. It can't be perfect. That's okay, depending on how you understand which places it's wrong, what you can know, what you can't. And so fundamentally, these kids are also coming without believing there's a thing you can know. They really have been driven with so much of this, well, there's my truth and there's your truth. Well, okay, but if there's my truth and there's your truth, then you can't have 2 + 2 = 4. Mm-hmm. So they don't know how to rely on mathematics as true, and they don't understand that, well, we still have to interpret what it means, and that's a place for debate, because they don't understand the difference between that. They don't understand what's a given. They don't understand what it means to define what we know and what we don't, because they don't know what we know. They're used to feeling, right? And they're not used to being clear on the boundary between, this is what I know, this is what I don't, this is where I can enlarge my knowledge, these are the steps I can take to do that, this is a reasonable assumption, these are my assumptions, I can write them down. And if you can't do that, then you can't do science. And so all of that goes back to they've never been given either the grammar or the rhetoric. I mean, so it's not just that they don't know math, they don't know any language arts. They don't know enough grammar and rhetoric to form a coherent thought and write it down. If you can't summarize your thought into a sentence and clarify, this is what I hold, this is what I believe to be true, this is what I found, right? If you can't make something that has a truth value associated with it because you're busy, blah, 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 I have all these words, I want to investigate something from the agricultural perspective, right? If you can't say, I think so, even though, yes, they're desperately poor in their math skills, they don't trust their math skills, I think it's their thinking skills that are worse. And we used to teach language arts to make us concise thinkers. Mm-hmm. And then math was very abstract and not everyone appreciated it, but it's a different kind of clarity, but it's the same idea. I'm going to write down very succinctly what I know, what's true. And so the inability to teach rhetoric, the inability to teach writing a sentence properly, a paragraph properly, has a knock-on effect. The inability to understand math, the inability to understand an abstraction. When am I computing something? When am I performing inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning? All of that is lost. And so it's kind of in this miasma that they want to do science. And it's interesting, like Gina was saying, they're excited and they are at 30,000 feet and they think that counts. Yeah. But that doesn't count, right? You have to actually do the work, and they don't have any idea how to do any work. And I remember not knowing. I remember what it felt like. So it's not like I didn't survive this, but somewhere in my 20s, I figured it out, and I had to overcome all of that. And I think I think in school we're far worse now. They're rewarded for all the things that aren't thinking concisely. They're rewarded for all the times they do pad their paper with words. And I think that their own teachers don't want to drill down on you. If you really performed an experiment, you should have gotten more wrong answers, right? There's no way you could have gotten it to work out so nicely. Science is extremely hard. It's impossibly hard to repeat an experiment and get the same answer twice. And so you have to work at it until you can, over and over. I don't think they have any idea that that's required, but they don't know enough to see they didn't get the answer.
Oh, it's one thing for all the attacks we do on Western culture with critical theory and what have you. Nobody ever teaches what the philosophy of science and what the ideas and norms of science are anymore. So students don't even know why science is racist. Apparently, they just mouth it as they've been taught. The other thing I was going to say is just like I don't just intersect with the students with the nature of my position. I also intersect with other sciences, but I also end up working a lot with professional societies and peer-reviewed journals and all those kinds of good things. Right. And as many of you have said going through this, now this is not a new problem. This is a really old problem that we're dealing with critical theory. You talked about math in the 90s and all that. The people who went through that back in the 80s and 90s and the start now are the people who are now are editors for journals, editors for peer-reviewed journals and things like that. So you're starting to see more of this kind of social justice stuff end up popping up in journals. And a good example is Nature. Nature is the preeminent of the preeminent. If you're a scientist, less than 7% of anything submitted is published in Nature. And yet they have so much things about, tackling systemic racism requires the system of science to change. That was straight on the editorial pages of Nature. Another article, I think it was peer-reviewed article, an actionable anti-racism plan for the geosciences, which is where my field falls into, is geosciences. And one of the teaching things that's gone wrong, you can tell in all this, is the lack of logic in here in the abstract with it. Because I read that article, first sentence, went to the other article it was referencing. It said, racism thrives in the geosciences. Went to the other article. All they said in the other article was, look at this disparity between races. Never proved that the reason why, in the article, never proved that the reason why was because of racism. And this was cited off by another journal, and it's probably going to get cited off by even more and what have you. So these kinds of things are starting to come up in the scientists now who are my generation, a little bit older. So for the record here, I'll be 35 in a couple of weeks. So it's really problematic. And I hope there can be a lot of course correction that's done here soon in K through 12, because otherwise it's going to get really bad for the sciences, I think.
Well, because of speaking of K through 12, I want to cut back to Mrs. G, because that's where she's teaching the language arts. And Allison has just referenced that, these people can't string a sentence together. So tell us, what are you saying now that you've got everything worked out with your sound? What are you saying?
Yes, sorry about that. So I go by Mrs. G because I am still in the school system, just to be anonymous. You never can be too careful these days. But I teach middle school and high school at Northern Iowa Public School. And I love the fact that I'm going last because I think people like me are responsible for all of these issues. Now, Ryan is also an English language arts teacher, but he has a much harder job than I do. He's still teaching kids to read. Now, thankfully, in my area, the youngest I teach is 8th grade. All of my kids know how to read. My job is to help them read better, write better, and think better. Now, this is where I think parents can get a little messed up. It's very common for parents to say, we need to be teaching kids how to think, not what to think. And while that should be true, there is such an issue with lack of objectivity in the English language arts that they do not have the framework to know how to think. If they don't have the the framework of vocabulary, they cannot engage with this abstraction. The analogy I give to my students is we look at different pixelated images, maybe a very low resolution image. That's how you are if you have a very low vocabulary. Now compare that to 1080p or a 4K resolution. And even the seniors that I have, they're still in low resolution vocabulary is how I would put it. But as you listen to all these panelists, there's a problem at the word level, and if you get into the younger kids, you could argue at a phoneme level. But if kids don't know what words mean, they can't do anything else. And I do teach classical logic and rhetoric. And the kids love it. Their minds are actually blown. They're like, oh my gosh, Mrs. G, I can't believe no one has taught us this. And it's really refreshing to see. But I think a big problem is that our English teachers, who should be the most educated, are sometimes the least educated. And here's why I think they should be the most educated, because every single one of these subject matter experts, they defer to the English department. In the Common Core, the English language arts standards have speaking and listening, reading, writing, of course, but also research skills. They call it 21st century skills usually come on us. So everything tends to come to the English department. Consider this as well. In many schools, the English core curriculum is divided into two. You have reading and writing. So sometimes I get kids twice as much as the other teachers. So really the buck stops in the English department oftentimes. And when there's really stupid thinking, just to cut to the chase, that becomes a problem. For example, I saw a really stupid meme the other day that English teachers like to pass around and show their students. You may have seen it. One figure is standing at the top of a 9, and the other is standing at the bottom of the same numeral. And the point is supposed to be, depending on how you look at something, it could be a 6 or a 9. Sure, sometimes. Unless you're trying to catch a train and you're trying to find the number 9 platform. And there is absolutely no framework in the Common Core for methodology of analysis. They'll go as far as to say that argumentation does not exist in literature. Really? Does 1984 not exist? Did Ayn Rand never try to make a point in literature? So we are not even giving kids the opportunity to pick out ideas from literature. Well, what happens then? The ideas are still there. And if I might give you another analogy, when I was in high school, I painted lines on a football field. And I realized that if you were even a hair of a degree off, these lines won't be parallel. Of course they won't. But you're not going to notice it until you get very far down the track. Now, we notice the wokeness in math. We notice the wokeness in science. But we don't notice the wokeness in English because it's all based in narrative. And it's supposed to be balanced because maybe you have your Ayn Rand over here. And maybe you have The Hate You Give and some other novels with more Marxist themes. And it's supposed to be balanced. It never is, though. So
I was going to say, where are they teaching Ayn Rand?
I do.
Oh, well, bless you.
I know. I'm very lucky. I get to do what I want, but of course, as long as my results are good. But to put a little hopeful spin on this, California schools, Oregon schools, they might be gone. You can hold the line in rural schools like mine. So maybe if you don't want to pull your kids out of public school, or you can't, you could consider moving to a rural area. Some of them have really good jobs. My house cost $20,000. Like, there are options there. And I was absolutely floored when I started at my new school a year ago. You see American flags. You see history teachers with Bill O'Reilly books. And you're like, oh my, you're allowed to have that? What is going on here? We have actual balance in the classroom. What is going on here? So it's just very refreshing to see. Obviously, that's not an option for everyone, but I would still encourage parents, if you need to narrow in an area, check out your English teacher, because we get many hundreds more hours with your kids than anyone else throughout their college career. So
That's
just
true.
ask
And
polite questions and you'll never know. Maybe you'll learn
in
something.
K-12, the emphasis, especially in the last 10 years, has been, well, the reading scores are not good, so we're going to, double the amount of time they spend doing ELA in the classroom, certainly K through 5, to the point where I've had students I've tutored in those age ranges who just hate it. Like, it's not a dislike of reading, it is a passionate hatred because they're spending double the amount of time with people who have no idea how to teach the subject matter. They aren't passionate about it. They don't love it. They don't themselves read well, write well, speak well. As you said, they are some of the least well educated. It's almost like the running joke when I was a kid is they would have the football coach teach social studies or maybe math. It was kind of like a running joke, although they can go in and teach that because, how hard is that? But it wasn't the English teacher who'd be, the least well educated. It was the opposite. Like you said, the English teacher tended to be the one who was, had a master's, possibly a PhD, even in a K-12 environment. My middle school English teacher was brilliant. And that was even in a public school. So I couldn't say the same necessarily for my math teacher, tragically. Okay. But today it seems to be the opposite, just like you said. It's almost like they're saying, well, you speak English to, talk on the phone, right? Okay, you can teach English. And because they're
Well,
giving people this, here's a method, use it to teach reading. Doesn't work, but here.
well, and another interesting piece from my background is I was homeschooled through 8th grade. Obviously went to public high school. I might have said that. And then I took about 10 years off to work in the private sector. When I came back to a 4-year university, the classes were easier than my high school. So it really shocked me. But at the same time, I work at a rural school. Rural schools don't go woke so fast because you have the farmers, you have the tradespeople. You're going to have a hard time convincing a plumber to go socialist when they're the ones literally dealing with the you-know-what. So I feel like in some of these areas we're a little safer, but it can happen anywhere. But the reason I bring that up is because I might be one of the few teachers in the entire United States who is lucky enough that I don't have to lie to kids for fear of getting struck down by the administration. Linguistics teachers lie to people. They say that certain dialects, like African American vernacular English, are equally expressive. Well, sure, in a narrative sense, but what is your goal? Is your goal to go into business? If those grammatical structures were ever matched up with advanced vocabulary, sure, it'd be fine if we snapped our fingers and we all spoke like that and matched it up with abstract thinking and advanced vocabulary. Great. But no, it's all slang. So we're lying to kids saying, you don't need to change anything about yourself. You're perfect. Speak how you are. No, I don't want to change you as a person, but I also want to basically teach you a second language. And you're not allowed to say that in most areas. And that is a very big problem.
Yeah, and I would say that's not just a thing to piggyback off Mrs. G, that this is not just a thing with, linguistics. It's also a thing with just knowledge or ways of knowing more generally. And there's a more of an idea of, okay, we have to incorporate more cultural indigenous knowledge. And for some things that's okay, but we're also not teaching the thing then of what do you do when those two things don't agree with each other. Right. When you're teaching, like, science doesn't agree with whatever the indigenous knowledge is, there is a tendency to say, well, that's what they believe. That's what they believe. If we know the other thing over here is right, but that's what they believe. You have to agree with them on that. That's what they believe. There's a tendency to do that. So I have yet to see anybody come to a real thing of how do we navigate that divide. But I know that's going to happen more and more as we're seeing more of an interest in incorporating indigenous knowledge in some sciences.
I'm that mean person who's like, okay, super. That's a belief. These are facts. Nice to know you. I mean, like, I don't have a conflict, but then I'm like a sledgehammer usually. So
yeah,
Ryan, I wanted to ask you, do you feel, so Mrs. G is saying she feels fortunate. She doesn't feel afraid. She doesn't have to lie to the students. How do you feel in your setting? Do you feel like you have to watch your back? about what you say and how you're teaching what you're teaching, or are you just so consumed by discipline you haven't even gotten there yet?
Ooh, tough one. Just in terms of, I think with my age and everything that I've done, I mean, I've done things ranging from literally farming all the way up to coaching collegiate Division I athletics and everything in between, to the point where, sure, who isn't concerned about, putting bread on the table type of stuff. But I'm becoming more and more, and you know me from my online personality, but you're becoming more and more, standing up for the truth. And wherever that takes me now, I've moved to a place where our values are going to be accepted a lot better and a lot, in a different capacity than where I left. But what I'm trying to do is be fair, but stand on my principles and values. And wherever that leads, that's where the doors the Lord opens, and that's where I go. And so I'm going to focus on my students and what my students need, and be a team player. But there have already been times where I stood up and just said, no, I'm not doing that. I'm just not going to go that route. Or in the worst case scenario in our classroom, I'll teach the counter narrative. I'll teach the objective facts, and I'll try to plant some seeds of the nuanced takes, as opposed to, well, it's got to be systemic racism. Well, that's an easy cop out. That's there might be pieces of that, especially the school I'm working at. There is a deep history of racial justice, and we're talking 1960s and 30s and 40s type of stuff. So like legitimate, racial justice. So there's a deep history there. And what I do love about the school I'm working at is the older people and how much they love that school and that history. Unfortunately, what's happened is that it's gotten mixed up with this current neo-Marxist trend. And I don't know that those people, and let's come back to teachers and what they know and don't know. And I really do believe there's a lot of teachers, they really don't know what critical race theory is. They don't know what it is. They don't know its roots. They don't know what, how it, came from Gramsci and Hegel, all the way back to Hegel. I mean, James Lindsay's been educating all of us on the deep roots of that stuff. They see it as, well, it's just an understanding of other cultures, and we just want to understand them better. That's a direct quote, by the way. And we just want to understand, why they do what they do. Well, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, that makes us, I try to understand all my students on an individual level, though, and so forth, because each one comes from different backgrounds. But we in this group, we know what critical race theory and its application, its praxis really is. And I can see that in a core novel we're teaching right now. It's sprinkled in there. And it's
and you were assigned this core novel that you had to read?
Yes, it's one of our 6 core novels for the year. Having said that, I don't even know if the kids really pick up on it. Unfortunately, they think the book's great, and it's actually not very good. It's just basically a teenage kid with superpowers who whines the whole time and complains about his life, and doesn't really. It's not good. It's not good literature. And something I've been thinking about in relation to this conversation is, we have a lot of people. So I'm going to talk to parents out there. We talk about, well, we got to go back to classic literature. Absolutely. So then what I've been thinking about and processing in my 40-minute drive to school and back every day is why, how can we defend classical literature? And one of the things I came to the conclusion of, and whether it's right or wrong, is one of the things with classic literature is it's been vetted for a long time. Doesn't mean that there's not stuff that's current that's good. But what I mean by the classic literature is it's been vetted and taught over and over again, and we've refined those values that we pull from that. Not just the reading level, but the meta narratives and the things we want our students to learn, right? Because the key of fiction is to learn a message, right? What is the big message we want our students to learn, and pull from that on a personal level, and not the base level stuff. And so
they're timeless too.
Yeah.
I mean, we go to what Mrs. G was saying about vocabulary. You're not going to push that student and really get them to develop their vocabulary without reading challenging literature. Challenging literature tends to be from the classics. And then I think of classic, what makes a classic, because as you point out, something could be more modern that is still a classic,
Mhm.
is that the themes are timeless. It won't matter if you read it 100 years from now. It's not going to be, some of the clothing and some of the language might be anachronistic, but the theme will not. You can read Homer today
Mhm.
and you're still a hero's journey. Okay. You can read The Count of Monte Cristo, and you read themes of betrayal and friendship and loyalty and, revenge. So, these are things that are applicable in life.
Yeah.
And so when I think about students, and, if I were teaching English, I'm not, but if I were, I would want them to read literature that caused them to think about themselves in, even though the characters don't have anything to do with them, even though their lifestyle is completely different. When the theme is classic, you have to think about, what do I think? What would I do? Where, what's my response to this, or where's this going to go next? I actually find it easier to put myself into a story where those themes are present in everyday life across all walks of life and all cultures. That's another thing that classic literature does, is it's not culture specific. The details of the descriptions might be, but the themes are not. The themes are not. And that's what they're missing, I think.
Well, let me add to that, and so I taught Romeo and Juliet for years, and I know that some of my neighbor teachers, they didn't necessarily hate it, but they weren't fans of teaching it. And I think that, what you're saying about timelessness, you talk about two teenagers committing suicide out of love. And what are we seeing in our society right now? We're seeing a large teenage increase in suicide, unfortunately. And so we would have those discussions in class, and once in a while they get pretty deep with the students and stuff. But you're right, for them to be able to see themselves and characters, and we would constantly bring up that he wrote that in the 1600s. It's not like it was written like last month or a couple of years ago. And so we would try to make those relationships. But you also talk about critical thinking skills with Shakespeare. You can talk about all the figurative language pieces and so forth. So there's we shouldn't be so ready to ditch the classics,
right?
But we also need to understand why.
Right. Somebody's giving you props here. The point of fiction is to learn a lesson. I love that. Well said, Ryan. Thank you, Shane. Yep. We don't read enough fiction, period. So, let's start there. There's a lot of passages now, not a lot of reading of fiction. So yeah, Romeo and Juliet was never my favorite, but I love the figurative language. Nowadays, they're teaching something called No Fear Shakespeare, which I'm sure Mrs. G doesn't use, but some of these teachers are using it. And when my daughter was assigned it in an honors English class, when she went to 1 year of public high school, I was appalled, and I insisted that she read the regular. So what is even the point of reading the story if you don't read it in the original? That's what makes it great, is the word choice. So let me ask Patrick, because I want to come back to you. I know you're dealing with physics, but do you find the same thing is true in terms of the way students are thinking, that they lack? And of course, they're probably speaking French, but even so, do you find that their ability to construct sentences and their ability to think using language is impaired, or less than you would expect it to be, or that it needs to be to engage with the material? Are you finding that as well?
To some extent, yeah. Language is less important when it comes to just calculations, right? So we do mostly mathematical work, but the little I've seen, I really feel that the language skills have gone down quite a bit for a while. I wanted to just add something, because Mrs. G has mentioned, talking about English, and all teachers have a big role. And actually, even in the context of science, there's a big impact from the English teachers. For example, at my college, which again is really like the first year for us is like the last year of high school in the US. So just to give an idea, the physics teachers teach very specialized physics, the calculations and so on. but there's a class given by someone in another department, in the English department, about science writing. And what I find is that like that teacher doesn't know basically any science really, which is fine. But then I was looking at the work that they have students do, and I found it appalling because, for example, the prof had given some project to some students about climate change, and the teacher was using just reference from newspapers as to use for argue for one point of view or not, or another, and the teacher, and we know most mainstream newspapers are very, very biased in that respect, and the teacher was using one of the most biased newspaper in the UK as the main reference, and I was floored by it. I really was upset by that. And so just to, I guess I want to point out to parents that there's a lot of influence, even on the science side, when it comes to issues like climate change and so on, that we read about in newspapers and so on. There's a lot of bias that is pushed on the students, and they're not taught to really have critical thinking and to really analyze, go deeper than the very superficial level that we're given by the mainstream media, which
Right.
is very
Yeah, exactly. So Ryan, I guess we agree with you as far as the class. I definitely agree with you about the classics, 100%. Mrs. G, do you agree too about the classics? Do we need to bring them back?
Absolutely. One of the challenges, I think, other than the wokeness of them saying it's a whitewashed curriculum, yes, it's unfortunate we don't have more of those voices back then. That is very unfortunate. But one of the problems is you need to go back to the classics to see real problems like communism and things that people just don't want to talk about. And then it gets to the point where kids are afraid to even think. We were discussing a piece of literature in our logic and rhetoric unit, and we were specifically looking at the Kafka trap fallacy. And the Kafka trap, of course, is basically like, you're guilty of this, and the fact that you're denying it just proves that you're guilty. Well, they started thinking, oh, that reminds me of COVID. Oh, it reminds me of... What does it remind you of? We already have an understanding that you all are free to have a rational discussion. You're seniors. You need to risk being offensive to actually think. We have that understanding. It'd be inappropriate for me to pontificate to you, but say your piece. What parallels are you noticing? And most administrations do not let anyone say such things sometimes. They're just too afraid to get into murky waters, which I understand in some of these bigger areas. Maybe you don't know what the parents are going to think or say, but
I just don't know how education happens without that.
Exactly. What else are you going to do?
It doesn't. Just to say on that, it doesn't happen. You need to be able to express controversial opinions or different opinions, even if it offends. And that's one thing that I've noticed is students, at least coming into college, don't seem to be able to take it if someone disagrees with them. And now there's the data there with it. So the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education just today released their Scholars Under Fire report, and looking at the last five and a half years-ish or so of cancel culture related attacks on university campuses. And what they found, first off, was that 74% of them resulted in the targeted person suffering some kind of punishment on campus. So it's like 74% of attacks were successful in getting some kind of punishment against the person who was targeted by the smear campaign or cancel culture. The other thing that they found, which was a surprise to me when I dug into it, was that the majority of the targeting campaigns, as they called it in the thing, are initiated by undergraduates. They're not initiated by scholars. They're initiated by undergraduates who just don't like what this person said. And they were looking at specifically targeting against scholars in this particular case, not against just individual staff or anything like that. This was specifically about faculty. But if you think about it then that way, you're terrified as a professor, perhaps even to speak your mind with the students, if you know the students are going to get you fired or get you reprimanded at the very least. And sometimes it can end in tragic fashion. Because there's one case I know of in UNC Wilmington. It was a political science professor. He was a big Trump fan, and he wasn't shy about it. And his students didn't like it, and it resulted in a whole targeting campaign. He had tenure, so the university couldn't fire him, but because it was causing such bad press, they negotiated his retirement essentially. And the harassment was just so much that he got that 2 days before his retirement took effect, he was found dead in his house from a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Oh my God.
So this is where it gets to really, I'm sorry to have to be such a downer with it, but it gets to a really bad place if we're not allowed to have disagreement, because then it just opens the door to letting students think it's okay to harass somebody for having a different point of view. And that's one of the other things that concerns me. I'm sorry, I'm ranting a little bit here, but it's one of the things that concerns me is the dehumanization that's being allowed. It's being taught that it's okay to dehumanize somebody. And I think, Deb, you mentioned this a little bit in your mother's plea earlier today. But that's what I'm seeing is like, it's really sometimes scary to walk around a university campus right now. And Patrick may feel the same way. I don't know how it is in Quebec versus the US, but yeah, some interesting things that are unfortunate.
I guess these are the consequences of the self-reflective writing assignments and all of the self-focused. They are steeped in the idea that their emotions are telling them things that are true all the time. And if they feel that something is offensive, then it must be wrong and it must be fought, and that they are all steeped in the idea through coming up all the way from little, elementary school all the way up through the system, that the world is this broken, terrible place, and that they're not just supposed to take care of themselves and their loved ones, but they have to go out there and make a difference and fix big problems. And they're filled with so much anxiety that's fueled by this. So they actually probably do not have the ability, I'm wondering, on average, to actually like pick apart a complicated issue and look at all of the different sides and the different ways that you can approach it. They just feel and act, and it's very scary. So
yeah, that's so true. And you have that. All of this impacts that. If you don't have a vocabulary, you don't have the foundation for that. But even before that, if you can't read, so you can't encounter challenging ideas, and then you can't be asked questions because you can't answer the questions, and you certainly not going to be able to write about it. And then if the writing assignments are journaling, that reinforces it. It's all part of the same thing. Ryan, are you allowed to, or I would say allowed, are you encouraged to have your students write, or are they supposed to journal too? How much can you ask of them as far as writing?
We do a lot of writing. I try to incorporate as much as possible, even if it's as simple as if we're covering vocabulary, that they're using them in sentences related to what we're reading about. We actually just taught last week or the week before objective summaries and how to pull out specific data. And I use the word bring the receipts. You can't just like, well, I feel this or what. No, you got to point out exactly in the chapter, in the page, or in the paragraph where you're getting that info from. So we spent a week working on objective summaries that we have built now into a permanent thing. But we also do a daily connection reflection where they're asked to write about connecting amongst the different courses that they take. Which I encourage them, and we've been working on it. It's hard with the sixth graders because it's new to them. I do encourage them not to necessarily write how they feel about things in their right? Their lived experience side of it, but bring, what did you learn in science today, and how does that relate to what we did in English, and how does that relate to social studies, et cetera? Because that's more my personality. It comes back to what others had talked about early on, which was how many teachers, they might know their subject area, but they don't know the other areas, especially the math and statistics. A lot of them, I'm amazed, not so much necessarily the people I work with right now, because I'm new to the building, but I have worked with people in the past who would just brush off statistics, partly because they didn't understand them. And they didn't understand how to use them, or they were overloaded by them, et cetera. But coming back to the writing, we do a lot of writing, and I would encourage, parents to have their kids write all the time, especially from an objective standard, not just, those reflective, personal pieces. So
it's interesting to think about how the students that I encountered over the last year in our company, they seem to not have the humility to see where they are in their knowledge, like where they are along that knowledge acquisition journey. So they will state what they think, well, what we should really be doing is this, or here's my thoughts on where this field should be going. But they just started. They don't have a lot of years behind them of really engaging deeply with a field of study to know what's been done, what's worked, what didn't, where the open questions are. That takes a long time. You don't come out of undergrad necessarily having any grasp of that, but they're used to just being able to say, like, this is what I think, full stop. And they're not used to actually having to explain, why do you think that? Where did you get those ideas from? What are your sources? They'll say, like, from my brain. Like, they have no idea where, how you synthesize a bunch of things. Like, you take this source and this source and this source, and then you go, here's what I've learned, and I'm going to summarize that in my own words. This is how I have to explain to people how not to plagiarize. Like, that's how plagiarism happens, is they don't actually know how to synthesize what they've read. So they just take a piece here and a piece here, and they just paste it all together. And that's not okay. And they don't realize that that's not okay. I'm definitely rambling, and I'm sorry for that. This conversation, I feel like I should be in the audience, not in the panel. I've learned so much from hearing all of you speak about sort of what happens before I see them. So this is, it's just been simultaneously nauseating and fascinating.
Right.
So,
right. So Ryan, there was a point that you wanted to bring up, I think, about education research or something.
Yeah. So Gina and Adrian and others were talking about research, especially from the science side. And I've done a lot of work in the last, I'd say, year and a half, looking into educational research. Especially with my work in studying critical race theory and how it's been coming in from the colleges of ed. And what I'd like a lot of people to know, especially parents, is in an educational, like a teacher's program, from day one, they'll start to inundate the students with best practice. That's their language, or it may have changed now, but when I went through, it was best practices, best practices. I'm sure there are good professors out there, for sure, that will bring in the actual research, have the students read the research and digest it, et cetera. But when you really look at educational research, a lot of times it's ethnographic, which basically is a reflective journal. It's a journal entry. And a lot of times the data, if they actually have any data involved, it might be like, for example, one I read, a professor from one of the Illinois universities, he did a dissertation on his first grade students. That was it. First grade students. As if that's a standard for all first graders across the country. He writes this paper. And in that paper, by the way, he did research on first graders pretending to be night riders, and KKK Klansmen. And I can send that to Deb at some other point. And I might be a little off with that, but it was that extreme with first graders. And there were other activities he did, and he was able to get away with it because he has a certain demographic makeup that it passed, et cetera. And he's got his doctorate, and that was his dissertation. Was one class, one first grade classroom doing a lesson, and that was his research model. And so, even though I don't have a super strong background in science, I at least have a basic understanding of those things and on how to do research, or at least basics from that end of things. And the ed psych research is generally just not very strong. And then they pass it off as this is best practice. And I encourage people to start looking at these dissertations and really read them carefully.
Mhm.
They can be tough, not so much from the content, because they're not hard to read, but just from a frustration level. Because then you read them and then you understand why we end up with what we do in the schools.
Right. When like the one that I talked about today, I think one of my videos is the research about so-called learning styles is not anything we would call research. No scientist worth his or her salt would call the learning styles research scholarly. And yet, how often have you heard about learning styles? How often have you been told it was best practices to teach to learning styles? There's no such thing. Each and every human learns in multiple ways. There are different ways that we access information, and sometimes simultaneously. And we may have a preference in, one moment for something or one piece of information another way. But if you take a snapshot in time and decide that's how somebody prefers to learn all the time across all subjects, you're gonna mess them up and spend a whole lot of time and a whole lot of money focusing on something that has no basis in reality. And yet I can't tell you how many people I hear, parents especially, well, my child is the kinesthetic learner and my child's an auditory learner and my child's a this. And like, no, they're not. And I
Yep.
don't have the heart to just interrupt them mid-sentence, but this is one of those things. Some of the ed research just won't die. It's
Yep.
almost like what sounded good and what made people feel like they could, instantly apply something in their class or sound really smart, got a lot of press and made it into the classroom, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's data to support it.
Well, ed psych, they tend to fall in. It's a fad. If you look at the ebbs and flows of education, it's constantly hit with fads. Multiple intelligence, what you're talking about. You look at the top psychological scientists, et cetera, and in the old days they called it talents, right? So instead, what we should be looking at, right, is big five personality traits, IQ and those pieces, and then add those in as supplementary pieces.
Sure. Right.
I have a question for the educators that know the education research a little bit better than I do. Was multiple intelligences and those kind of trends, did they emerge to discredit IQ as a valid metric in a sense? Because I remember people who I know who have PhDs who are very well educated believe that IQ is meaningless. And I remember being really surprised because IQ it's not a metric of your worth as a person, but it is meaningful. It is measuring something real, and it's quantitative reasoning. And so I think that was that research sort of like a response, or in a sense, to try to discredit IQ, to like level the appearance that everyone is equally intelligent and all that kind of thing? Or like, where did that come from?
I honestly don't know, because I was speaking more to the learning styles, like, the impression that children have an affinity or a preference for a particular way of learning, and that you should know what your child's is and then teach everything that way. Right.
I see.
So I think the multiple intelligence is a little different. I wouldn't be surprised. I think there were all kinds of efforts, overt and covert and even just accidental, to fill the gap left when IQ was unfashionable. We're not going to talk about that because it hurts people's feelings. But even that speaks to the lack of understanding of math. Like you just said, it's quantitative reasoning, quantitative analysis. You go where the data leads you. It's not personal. It doesn't tell us anything about why a thing is. It tells us nothing. It just tells us what is. That's it. We see what is. Now you have to do the qualitative research to try to understand, which is less exact science, but okay, to try to understand the whys. and there are many different variables, but we seem to jump straight to the why, start with a conclusion, and then cherry pick little pieces of data to support the conclusion we've already arrived at because it's whatever, politically expedient or what have you. And so of course IQ is going to get thrown out, because if you're going by feelings and making a value judgment about numbers, then you can't interact with that data without having an emotional reaction. And I think we have now a couple of generations of people who fit that description. You even bring up IQ and it's like, and you're like, okay. They refer to Charles Murray as some kind of a fascist, a Nazi, a white supremacist, and the guy's just a social scientist.
Yeah, his book is fascinating and dense and dry and full of data, and it was a mind-blowing read if you can sit through all of that.
The latest book or the
it's like a continuation coming apart with all the super zips and all that data.
That one. Yeah. The most recent one is actually short and concise and to the point, and you can read it in an evening.
Okay.
And I really wish everyone would read it because it's important information, but people just look at it and think.
What's the title of that one?
It is called brain fart.
It's not, the bell curve is the older one,
no,
right?
It's the most recent one. I'll look for it. But okay. So I know there was somebody else had a comment to piggyback on something here, or had a question. I wanted to make sure I got to everybody because I was getting notes. Patrick, it was Adrian. Okay.
Well, Patrick wanted to make a comment on the classics I saw, so if he can go ahead because I'm in a different topic direction. So,
okay. Well, whoever wants to go next, jump in. I'm going to look up that Charles Murray because.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to go back to the classics, what Ryan was saying, and it is definitely true that in French we have so many great writers, right? Sartre, Voltaire, Hugo, Dumas. So, but none of that is covered in high school anymore. They never see any of those great writers.
Even in Quebec.
Yes. And when I hear this argument of these were written by white men, and this, I get so upset because if you look at science. All our technology, almost all our technology or science was discovered in medicine, in physics, and the reason we have computers now, the cell phones, we have cars, everything was developed by white men, which doesn't make them superior in any way, but it just happened that this happened this way. So I don't see anybody just rejecting using computers because they were discovered and built on technology and science discovered by white men. But you go in literature, and apparently that's supposed to be a good argument to reject, some wonderful work.
Book title. It's Facing Reality, the Charles Murray. But what you're saying, Patrick, is something that has bothered me for a while now. This idea of cultural appropriation, it's kind of fine sometimes and not in others, and there's no objective standard to it. It doesn't even make any sense. It really doesn't make sense because, as you pointed out, the fact that things happened a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that they would have happened with other people if these people who did it got out of the way. It's not like, there's this zero-sum game and fixed pie mentality that we're teaching children. And we're teaching it across all the subject matter areas that I see. There, no sense of, like you said, there's no ability to analyze or think in abstractions. To think, I don't like to use the term critical thinking anymore because I think of critical theory, but I do like to use the term active thinking, where your mind is actively trying to get to the truth, or it's actively trying to find evidence to support your ideas, to challenge your ideas. And if it isn't there, you go looking for more evidence. And the willingness to be wrong isn't there either. I don't see students and even adults, young adults, who are comfortable not knowing an answer. or being corrected and told, actually, that's incorrect. That's not the right answer. Often you'll get the says who, or, well, that's my answer, the my truth, your truth. And we've been encouraging that. We've increasingly across all subject matter areas, we've been encouraging this relativism and subjectivism. And it's now become a kind of offense to tell someone you're wrong or you don't know something, you're ignorant. Like, ignorant to me isn't necessarily an insult. It's a statement of fact. You don't know about something, especially about what you're speaking, like you're saying, here's where this field should go. Here's where I think climate science should go next. Okay. And you're, an undergraduate, you just got there. To me, they don't even recognize the hubris, but it's kind of ridiculous that somebody would say that. And if you say, well, you're ignorant of the facts, or maybe, Adrian, and correct me if I'm wrong, they probably had the temptation to say, gosh, if only someone had thought of that. Like, to some of the suggestions that get made, I've had that said to me, like, what really needs to happen. And then what they're talking about is something someone tried and it didn't work, maybe 100 years ago or whatever. And you think, yeah, that if only someone else had that idea and tried it and failed. And I think that's why we're seeing a resurgence in the affinity for socialism, Marxism, for all these ideas, is that they've literally not been taught that these things have been tried. Yeah. And they failed. They didn't work by any measurement. And it's not, you don't get to think maybe this time it'll work because my feels, that's not how anything works. So the overall sense I have is that all these building blocks that you're representing here in this panel are either missing or rudimentary at best. And so they don't know how the world works. And that we have students growing up in a world and a reality they are ill-equipped to understand, and then ill-equipped to come to terms with their lack of understanding. What do you think? Am I right, wrong? Is there anyone have anything to say about that? That's my guess. But what do you see?
I definitely agree with you, Deb. And I also have a theory that sometimes it's not even about the teacher wanting to share their views. It's not necessarily that the teacher is a true believer in some of this critical theory. I think sometimes it manifests in two ways. I think teachers are scared of some of the old ideas and the classics. What if I'm reading this aloud to students and I mispronounce something? What if? So like, you know what?
Wow.
The guy was probably racist anyway. Also, I think a lot of teachers are afraid of their own students. As soon as students get bored, what are they going to do? They're going to start talking, especially the younger they are. Maybe they're going to start roughhousing. We'd better keep it modern, and we'd better keep it engaging. And what is engaging for kids? Bleeding heart politics is engaging for kids.
Why? When I was a kid, I was like, politics. I could not have cared less what the grown-ups were doing in Washington or the capital of my state. I didn't even know, didn't care. That was just not something I was even encouraged to concern myself with. I think I was about 15 and I started to engage with that. And at 10, I was aware of the election. I was aware of things. When Carter's your president, you can't help but be aware of it. But I still had an understanding that I'm a kid and I haven't been around long enough, just living and breathing on the planet, to really engage with this intelligently. So any opinion I have, I'm going to either keep to myself, or if I voiced it and I got shot down, I wouldn't be surprised. Right. So it wasn't it just wasn't a thing. But now it's like every kid has an opinion,
but
and they think they're right about it.
They're given a lot of power. I mean, they're listened to, and they're given a lot of power. They see that they're, from Greta Thunberg to, everybody else, they are given much more power now, instead of being told, you still have to learn a lot. So learn before you tell us your opinion. So I think that has changed a lot.
Well, and yeah, and it's also that the hubris of my feelings matter. Therefore, I'm allowed to tell you whatever I want, and you have to listen to me, and I'm right. Humor
And
is youth sometimes, right?
And like you're saying now, undergrads have enough power to get teachers fired. So
That's amazing. So where do we go from here? So we've talked a lot about what we're seeing, what some of the problems are. Um, I think Adrian, you were actually had a question about that, right?
Yeah, I did, because I'm of course thinking, we see all these problems, so what the hell do we do? Aside from not just homeschooling, because I think the common thread that I hear in all of us is that we have some exposure to reality. We're not living in a bubble, where we've been affirmed all of our lives on everything and what have you. So my thought is, how do we burst that bubble a little bit? Because it needs to be burst in some of these kids that are coming up from high school and into college. And I was thinking myself of, what about a service kind of component, or making sure they get into service? And I'll use myself as an example. It's probably the best thing that ever happened to me in college was not all the classes or anything like that. It was 16 years ago, after Hurricane Katrina. It will be 16 years in March. I was doing a service trip to help out with all the damage and destruction down there, and mud mixed with insulation and all this kind of other things, boats where they shouldn't be and cars where they shouldn't be on top of houses. And it gave you a real visceral sense of, this is a real thing that I'm studying that has real impacts on people, because I was a meteorology major at the time. And then you met the people too, because we were refurbishing houses while we were there. So you met people, and it was like, I met a woman who was burying her parents because, the hurricane took both her parents and things like that. And they thought very differently from me, but, that was a trip where you realize just how human people are and how much they have suffering. But it's also, they had a lot more suffering than I ever did, going through, being in college and being able to do my degree kind of thing. There are others who won't be able to do that because of things like Ida. Now, they probably just had a lot of their dreams ripped away from them all at once. So how do you go about bursting that bubble that gets kids to recognize there's more than their own little world out here that they need to think about?
Right.
Get them off the screens.
That would be one.
That would be
I was thinking
my prescription pad would be get off the internet. I'm saying this on the internet because that's where the people are that need to hear this advice. No, I'm serious. I think when you're in that activist bubble is in the blogs, it's in the news. The news is run by all the people that have grown up all through they're reinforcing this very narrow Hollywoodified news media churning view of the world that is very narrow. It's absolutely not what most people's world is really like when you get out there. So that would be like my prescription pad for the future.
Right. Well, and also to be aware that even when they're off the internet, it's not just a straight shot from, okay, cool, I took away the phone and took away the video games, the kid's not on the internet anymore. If you made it all the way to Ryan's class in 6th grade in a setup where there's been, a problem with everything from teaching, reading, teaching math, like all the way through, you are dealing with a child who has so much remediation to do to be ready to engage with the world. Now, I can't decide in my mind, if we just should encourage parents to be okay with, go ahead and go back to the beginning. I mean, it's hard. It's really hard. It's like learning a foreign language when you're older, as opposed to when you're a little kid. So you've missed a window of opportunity where your brain is super elastic and you can do all this, and you have to undo a lot of bad habits and bad thought patterns.
Yep.
I can't decide if that's the way to go, or if we need to take like an entire generation of people, or everyone who is in that kind of bubble, and just take them in a boot camp or something, like, oh, let's go out and do some farming for a year, or something
exactly.
so completely out of the ordinary from their regular life, where they are thrust into reality and become aware immediately of the importance of all of this learning. So there's an appreciation of, oh, and then maybe they will take themselves back. I've met adults who had fair to middling or tragically mediocre educations all the way through 12th grade, but then something forced them into the working world, the working, like when I say working, I mean with their hands, like getting dirty, but they couldn't go to college, and having had to do that and support themselves or support their family, they suddenly realize, like, you know what? I really need to go back and relearn all the stuff I didn't learn in school. And they did it. And they went and they did it. Or you take an example like of Frederick Douglass, or, some other people who were prevented from learning to read and prevented from accessing this information, but then realizing this is the key to my freedom. This is really the key to having any kind of a life. I have to do this. My concern, though, is that we have done such a great job of disguising reality as accessible easily, like without all of that, especially when you throw in this equity, diversity, equity, like as if somebody could go, well, I'll fill the bill. They'll hire me, even if I don't know anything, because I fit the, they're going to put me in the little box and, check the box. We've given people this impression that it's more important what you look like or what you represent than what you know and what you can do. And
for sure.
I don't know where they would ever even fully realize it, unless things get so bad against all of our will, okay, that it just happens to them. But as far as if things stay as they are now, I don't know what the incentive would be.
To clarify something, because I said that the get them off the screens is like one part of a multi-part recommendation, but I won't ramble on about it. I do think that reality exposure, letting them fail, like stop passing them through the checkpoints, let them get an F, let them not get something, let them realize that they actually have to have a skill first. Bring back hard tests, like make people recognize, and I think discouraging college for a lot of people and tell them to work.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
That matures people very quickly.
Your brain doesn't reach maturity until you're 25. So you really shouldn't be going to college until you're at that point anyway. But I was also going to say that real quick. I mean, that, to your point, there's about engaging. There's, being able to engage, you're ready to engage with the real world, but there's also the desire to, you want to. And that's the other thing I'm kind of concerned of, is just like, how do you get kids to want to actually engage with the real world?
We've told them for the last 18 months they don't need to. It'll come to your door. Now, I know we're approaching the 2-hour mark, and I know everybody's got to go, and you've been so generous with your time. So let's just do a quick, parting words. Rachel, you go first. Just like, what's your final thing you'd like to say to everybody? And then we'll just kind of go around in a circle.
I would part with some practical advice. Just try to research, learn what you can, and try to get on the same page as the teachers and administrators. They might not be wackadoodles like you think. Keep trying to discredit things like the New York Times, CNN. We're still taught in teacher school those are credible sources. Well, they're not any more perfect than your right-wing sources like Breitbart or take your pick. And I think once we can get through that mirage, I think parents will have a lot easier time. And at the end of the day, just homeschool if you can.
Okay. Brian, you?
I'd leave parents with, no matter where your child is in the learning process, we advocate big time, especially in my classroom, that we're going to make today better than yesterday. And we just keep one step forward. Like I said, I've got a lot of students that have a lot of issues out of their control. So when they come to our room, we focus on, let's make this time better than it was, before this, and includes reading, includes math, etc. It's just, let's just keep moving forward. And if you can read or know one more word today than you did yesterday, then you're moving in the right direction, and you'll eventually get there.
But you don't lower the standards to do it.
No.
Right. Keep the standards high and just keep going. And Patrick, how about you?
I'd like to emphasize that even if you have kids who are taking hard science courses like physics or math, you should not expect the teachers to be necessarily fair and objective and show critical thinking, you can get from those teachers as much indoctrination as in any other classes. So be careful with that.
Okay, thank you. Adrian?
Yeah, one of my parting things of advice would be to certainly don't send your kids to college. At least not right out of high school, just because they haven't developed the maturity and developed their worldviews and values and things like that. Encourage them to work for a while, would be my recommendation. I actually did that between grad school degrees, actually undergrad and grad school degrees, and that was extremely helpful for me. So I recommend that. And also, I would say, there are scientists out there like myself who would be more than happy to go talk to homeschool parents and families, to talk to their kids and do science lessons with them. I think Patrick would probably be in that boat. So, you're welcome to reach out, because I'd be happy to do that. I think there'd be others who'd be happy to do that. Because partly because of Deb, I have no faith in the public education system right now.
Yay! I don't know about that.
Not just belittle the teachers that are here. You all are wonderful teachers, I can tell, but just system.
I wish Mrs. G were my English teacher when I had it. She's awesome. Okay, Gina, what about you?
Well, I echo what everyone else has said. And in addition, I would add an inoculum against harmful ideas is teaching your children really solid emotional management skills, because when they are told some of these ideas, they will have an internal sense that something's not right with that. When they're told that feeling bad is good, that's a good, no, that's not. Like that collective guilt and panic are normal feelings and healthy, and that it's okay to not have boundaries between yourself and your work and all of those things. Teach your children how to manage their emotions so that they recognize unhealthy mindsets when they are given to them, even if that thing comes from one of their teachers.
Excellent advice. And of course, I would everything everybody said, I would echo it too. So this brings us to the conclusion of our panel discussion tonight. We were supposed to have Frank McCormick, who's from Chalkboard Heresy. Unfortunately, power went completely out where he is. The transformer blew and he was unable to join us, but hopefully we'll have him on for a separate show about history, civics, government. And also Will Roche will be here next week and we'll talk to him about that as well. So thank you everyone for so generously donating your time to this worthy endeavor. This replay will be up immediately. Please share it with all your friends. Share it with everyone you know. This information is so valuable, and I can't thank you enough. So thank you, everybody, and good night.